Jake Martinez had been home from his second deployment for 3 months, but the adjustment still felt raw. The small town of Pinewood, Georgia hadn't changed much while he was overseas, though he supposed he had. The faces were familiar, the streets still quiet, but something fundamental had shifted inside him. The sleep didn't come easy anymore. The sudden sounds made him jump. The crowds at the grocery store felt suffocating in ways they never had before. The only constant that made sense anymore was Ranger, his Belgian Malinois who'd served beside him in Afghanistan before they both retired. Ranger wasn't just a dog. He was Jake's battle buddy, his early warning system, his anchor to sanity when the nightmares came screaming in at 3 in the morning. The dog had detected IEDs that saved Jake's entire unit. He'd stood guard during long desert nights when danger lurked in every shadow. Now, in the quiet safety of rural Georgia, Ranger still worked, still watched, still protected. The military had offered to place Ranger with another handler, but Jake had fought tooth and nail to adopt him. They'd been through too much together to be separated by paperwork and protocol. On that particular October morning, frost clung to the grass like scattered diamonds, and Jake's breath misted in the cold air as he and Ranger took their usual route through the old industrial district on the edge of town. It was early, barely past dawn, and the world still held that hushed quality of a place not quite awake. Ranger trotted ahead with purposeful energy, his ears alert to every sound, his muscular body moving with the fluid grace that came from years of training and discipline. The area had been abandoned for years, ever since the textile mill closed down in the late 90s, leaving behind rusted equipment and forgotten vehicles slowly being reclaimed by nature. Kudzu vines crawled over chain-link fences, saplings pushed through cracked asphalt, windows in the old mill building gaped like empty eye sockets, and graffiti decorated walls that had once echoed with the sounds of honest labor. Jake liked walking here because it was empty, quiet, and nobody asked him questions he didn't want to answer. Nobody thanked him for his service with that awkward tone that said they didn't really know what to say. Nobody looked at him with pity or concern. Ranger suddenly stopped, his body going rigid in that particular way Jake recognized immediately from their time in service. It was the alert posture, the one that meant something important demanded attention. The dog's attention fixed on something ahead, partially hidden behind a collapsed section of fence that had rusted through and toppled into the weeds. Jake's heart rate picked up instinctively, his body responding to years of conditioning, even though his mind knew they weren't in a combat zone anymore. As they approached, Jake saw it clearly, a 1970s sedan, its blue paint oxidized to a chalky gray-brown that spoke of decades exposed to the elements. Windows were opaque with grime, spiderwebs, and what looked like years of accumulated pollen and dirt. The tires had long since rotted away, leaving the chassis sitting directly on the ground. Nature had begun swallowing it whole. Vines wound through the wheel wells, and moss grew along the lower panels where moisture collected. "Just an old car, buddy," Jake said, his voice steady but unconvincing even to his own ears. But Ranger wasn't listening. The dog circled the vehicle slowly, methodically, his nose working overtime as he processed scents Jake couldn't begin to detect. Ranger whined softly, a sound Jake had learned meant the dog was trying to communicate something important. Then the pawing started, insistent scratches at the passenger door that sent flakes of rust cascading to the ground. Jake had learned never to ignore Ranger's instincts. They'd saved his life more than once in the desert, had kept his entire unit from walking into ambushes or stepping on pressure plates that would have sent them home in boxes. If Ranger said something mattered, it mattered. Jake approached cautiously, his boots crunching on broken glass and dried leaves. He peered through the filthy windows but could see only darkness and the silhouettes of decay inside. The car looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry, left to rot and be forgotten like so many other relics of the town's industrial past. The passenger door resisted at first when Jake pulled on the handle. Rust had practically welded it shut, and he had to brace his foot against the frame and pull with both hands. The door finally gave way with a metallic scream that echoed across the empty lot, hinges protesting every millimeter of movement. A musty smell rushed out, the odor of mildew, rot, and decades of stagnant air trapped inside a metal tomb. The interior was a disaster. The dashboard was cracked and faded, the steering wheel barely recognizable beneath layers of grime. Empty beer cans littered the floor, along with fast food wrappers so old the logos were indecipherable. The seats were torn, their foam padding exposed and rotting, springs poking through like skeletal fingers reaching up from the dead upholstery. Water damage had stained everything a mottled brown, and mold grew in artistic patterns across the ceiling fabric that sagged down in drooping sheets. Ranger didn't wait for permission. The moment the door opened wide enough, he jumped inside, his compact body squeezing past Jake with practiced efficiency. The dog immediately moved to the back seat, his tail wagging frantically as he began to dig at something beneath the driver's seat, his paws working with determined intensity. "Ranger, out!" Jake called, concern creeping into his voice. God knew what could be under there. Rats, snakes, broken glass, rusty metal that could tear open even a tough military dog's paws. But Ranger ignored the command completely, something he rarely did, and that alone told Jake this was serious. Ranger continued digging with frantic determination, his claws scraping against the rusted metal floor of the car. Jake leaned in through the open door, trying to see what had captured his dog's attention so completely. The back seat was even worse than the front, the upholstery completely destroyed, springs and metal frame exposed like the rib cage of some long-dead creature. Dust motes danced in the shaft of morning light that pierced through the grimy rear window, and Jake had to wave away cobwebs that clung to his face and hands. "Ranger, what is it, boy?" Jake asked, his voice softer now, more curious than commanding. He'd learned to trust these moments, these instances when Ranger's training and instincts converged on something important. In Afghanistan, it had been explosives, weapons caches, or hidden dangers. Here, in this forgotten corner of Georgia, Jake couldn't imagine what warranted such intensity. The dog finally backed out of the vehicle, moving carefully in reverse until his hind legs found solid ground. When he turned to face Jake, something was clamped gently in his jaws, held with the same delicate precision Ranger used when retrieving training dummies without damaging them. Jake's heart stopped for a moment, his breath catching in his throat as he registered what he was seeing. It was a small leather bag, perhaps 10 inches long and 6 inches wide, the kind that might have once been a shaving kit or a personal effects pouch. The leather was cracked and stained, darkened by water damage and age, but it was still intact. The zipper was corroded, green with oxidation, and the stitching had rotted away in several places. But the bag had somehow survived whatever had claimed everything else in this automotive graveyard. "Good boy," Jake whispered, kneeling down to Ranger's level. "Good boy, Ranger. Let me see it." Ranger released the bag into Jake's outstretched hands with obvious reluctance, as if he understood the significance of what he'd found and wanted to ensure it was treated with proper respect. The leather was cold and slightly damp, and Jake could feel how fragile it had become. He stood slowly, holding the bag as if it were made of glass, and moved away from the car into better light. His hands trembled slightly as he examined the exterior. There were no identifying marks visible through the grime and decay, no name tags or labels that he could see. The zipper resisted at first, the corroded teeth not wanting to separate after so many years frozen in place. Jake worked it carefully, gently, aware that forcing it might destroy whatever was inside. Finally, with a sound like grinding sand, the zipper began to move, pulling back to reveal the bag's contents. Inside were letters, not just a few, but dozens of them, bundled together with rubber bands that had long since lost their elasticity. The moment Jake touched one of the bundles, the rubber bands disintegrated into sticky black fragments that clung to his fingers. The envelopes beneath were yellowed with age, their edges brittle and fragile. Some were stained with water damage, the ink bleeding into abstract patterns, but most were still remarkably intact, protected by the leather bag and the layers of other letters surrounding them. Jake carefully extracted the first bundle, his pulse quickening as he examined the envelopes. They were all addressed to various locations in Pinewood and the surrounding area. He recognized some of the street names, though he knew the addresses themselves might no longer exist. But it was the return address that made Jake's breath catch in his throat, that sent a chill down his spine, despite the warmth beginning to creep into the October morning. Corporal Thomas Chen, United States Marine Corps, followed by an APO address that Jake recognized as the military postal system used for overseas deployments. And the dates, all the postmarks and dates on the letters were from 1971. These letters were over 50 years old, written during the Vietnam War, and somehow they'd ended up in an abandoned car in rural Georgia, hidden beneath a driver's seat, waiting all this time to be discovered. Jake's mind raced with questions. How did these letters get here? Why were they never mailed? What had happened to Corporal Thomas Chen? The weight of history suddenly felt heavy in his hands, the burden of stories untold and words never delivered, pressing down on him like physical force. With trembling fingers, Jake carefully opened the first letter, acutely aware that he might be the first person to read these words since they were written decades ago. The envelope opened easily, the glue having long since lost its adhesive properties. Inside was a single sheet of paper, lined and slightly yellowed, covered in neat, methodical handwriting that spoke of discipline and care. The ink was blue, faded but still legible, and as Jake began to read, he felt as though he were intruding on something deeply personal, yet unable to stop himself. "Dear Mom and Dad," the letter began, and Jake could almost hear a young voice speaking the words. "I know my last letter worried you, but I'm okay. Really, I am. We moved to a new fire base last week, and the accommodations are actually better than the last place. We've got real bunks instead of sleeping on the ground, and the mess hall food is almost edible. The guys in my unit are good people. There's this kid from Georgia, actually not far from where Grandma used to live. Small world, right? His name is Bobby, and he talks about peach cobbler the way some guys talk about their girlfriends. Makes us all homesick and hungry at the same time." Jake found himself smiling despite the gravity of the moment. The voice in the letter was young, optimistic, trying to reassure worried parents half a world away. He continued reading, his eyes scanning the neat lines of text. "I think about home every day, about sitting on the back porch with Dad, drinking sweet tea and watching the sun go down. About Mom's cooking, and yes, Mom, I know I complained about your meatloaf, but I'd give anything for a slice of it right now. Tell Jenny I'm sorry I missed her birthday. I sent a card, but mail service here is unpredictable. Sometimes it takes weeks for anything to get through. I hope she liked the bracelet I sent. The local kids make them, and I thought the blue beads would match her eyes." The letter continued for another page, filled with small details about daily life, reassurances about safety, questions about home. It was signed simply, "Love, Tommy." Jake carefully folded it and returned it to its envelope, then reached for another letter, and another. Each one painted a picture of a young Marine far from home, desperately trying to stay connected to a family he loved, sharing pieces of his life in a war zone while trying not to worry them too much. There were letters describing the landscape, the people, the strange beauty of Vietnam that existed alongside the danger. Letters about friendships formed under fire, about small victories and daily frustrations. Letters that mentioned the rain, the heat, the boredom, punctuated by moments of terror. As Jake read through them chronologically, he noticed the tone shifting, becoming more contemplative, more philosophical. The earlier letters were full of youthful energy and optimism. The later ones carried the weight of experience, of having seen too much too soon. There were at least 30 letters, Jake realized as he carefully laid them out on the hood of the rusted car, arranging them in chronological order based on the dates written in the upper right corners. His hands shook slightly as he continued reading through them, each one a window into a young man's soul, a snapshot of life during one of America's most controversial wars. The morning sun had risen higher now, burning off the frost and casting long shadows across the abandoned lot. Ranger sat patiently beside Jake, occasionally nudging his handler's leg as if to remind him he was there, offering silent support. The letters progressed through early 1971, and Jake could trace Thomas Chen's evolution as a Marine through the changing tone and content of his words. The early letters from January and February were still relatively upbeat, filled with descriptions of his unit, the camaraderie among the men, small moments of humor that broke up the tension of their daily existence. One letter from February made Jake pause. "Dad, remember when you tried to teach me to fish and I spent more time tangled in the line than actually fishing? Well, one of the guys here, Martinez, no relation to the baseball player, has been teaching me patience. He says combat is 90% waiting and 10% chaos, and you need the patience for the 90% to survive the 10. I think about that a lot. I think about a lot of things you taught me that make sense now in ways they didn't before." Jake felt a strange connection forming across the decades. Here was another Marine, another young man learning the same hard lessons Jake had learned in a different war, a different desert, a different time. But the fundamentals remained unchanged. The bonds formed under pressure, the long hours of tedium punctuated by moments of intense action, the way combat aged you in ways that had nothing to do with calendars. As spring arrived in Vietnam, the letters from March and April showed Thomas becoming more reflective. He wrote about the Vietnamese people he encountered, their resilience, their struggles. He questioned the purpose of the war more openly, though always carefully, as if aware that his letters might be read by censors. "Mom, you asked me in your last letter if I think we're making a difference here. I honestly don't know anymore. The people in the villages just want to be left alone, to farm their rice paddies and raise their families. We're supposed to be helping them, but sometimes I wonder if we're just making things worse. But we're here, and we have a job to do, so we do it the best we can." The May letters grew darker. Thomas wrote about losing friends, about operations that went wrong, about the constant stress of never knowing who was friendly and who was enemy. One letter simply said, "We lost Jenkins yesterday. I can't write about it. I just needed you to know that I'm okay, but my friend isn't, and that's all I can say right now." Jake recognized that tone, that emotional shutdown that came from experiencing trauma too overwhelming to process. He'd written similar letters himself, though in the modern age they'd been emails that disappeared into the digital void, lacking the physical permanence of paper and ink. June brought a slight improvement in Thomas's spirits. He'd been promoted, given more responsibility, and seemed to take pride in leading his fire team. "Dad, you always said leadership isn't about being in charge, it's about taking care of the people under you. I get that now. I've got 3 guys who depend on me to make the right calls, to keep them safe, to bring them home. It's terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. I think I'm pretty good at it, though. The lieutenant says I have good instincts." July's letters were fewer, shorter, as if Thomas had less time or less energy to write. The handwriting became slightly less neat, more hurried. Jake could imagine him scribbling these notes between patrols, during brief moments of respite, fighting exhaustion to maintain his connection to home. "Haven't slept much in the past week. Operations tempo is high right now, but I'm okay. Please don't worry. Jenny, stop sending me care packages with those terrible cookies you make. They arrive crushed to powder, but the guys love them anyway. Keep sending them." August brought what seemed like a turning point. Thomas wrote about extending his tour, volunteering to stay longer because his unit needed experienced NCOs, and he couldn't abandon his men. "I know this isn't what you want to hear, Mom, but I have to stay. These guys are my brothers now, and they need me. Bobby from Georgia, the one who talks about peach cobbler, his wife just had a baby. He's got 6 months left, and I need to make sure he makes it home to meet his daughter. Martinez is short too, less than 3 months. I can't leave them now. I'll be home soon enough, just a few extra months. We'll have Thanksgiving together, I promise." Jake felt his throat tighten reading those words. The promise of Thanksgiving together, the optimism that he'd make it home, the selfless decision to stay and protect his brothers. These were the hallmarks of the Marines Jake knew, the values that had been drilled into him during his own service. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. Thomas Chen embodied that motto completely. September's letters showed the strain. Thomas wrote about the heat, the rain, the boredom that paradoxically coexisted with constant danger. He wrote about dreams of home, about counting days, about small rituals that kept the men sane. We've started a tradition. Every night before dark, we go around the circle and everyone says one good thing that happened that day. Sometimes it's big, mail call, decent food, no casualties. Sometimes it's tiny, seeing a butterfly, finding a dry spot to sleep, getting an extra cigarette. But we always find something. It helps. It reminds us that even here, even in this, there's still some good in the world. Then came October. The letters from early October were routine, unremarkable. Thomas wrote about the weather changing, about looking forward to the end of the monsoon season, about plans for when he'd finally rotate home. He'd started counting days, marking them off. 117 days until he'd see his family again. 112. 108. And then Jake found it, the final letter, dated October 18th, 1971. It was different from all the others, shorter, more formal, written with a gravity that permeated every word. The handwriting was still neat, still controlled, but Jake could sense the emotional weight behind each carefully formed letter. This wasn't a regular update to family. This was something else entirely. Mom, Dad, Jenny, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home. I'm writing this before tomorrow's operation, and I have a bad feeling about it. Not fear exactly, just a certainty that something is going to happen. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But just in case, I needed to write this down. Needed you to know some things. Jake's hands trembled as he continued reading, aware that he was witnessing a young man's final words to his family, written in the shadow of his own mortality. Jake continued reading Thomas Chen's final letter, his vision blurring slightly as the words sank in. The morning had grown warmer, but he felt cold, as if the ghost of that young Marine from 50 years ago was standing beside him, watching him read these intimate final thoughts. Don't be sad for me. I know that's asking a lot, but please try. I chose to serve, and I'd make the same choice again. Being a Marine has been the hardest and most meaningful thing I've ever done. I've seen the worst of humanity, but I've also seen the best. Men who would die for each other without hesitation, who find humor in impossible situations, who remain human even when everything around them is inhuman. That's worth something. That has to be worth something. Jake had to stop reading for a moment, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Ranger pressed closer against his leg, sensing his handler's distress. Jake rested one hand on the dog's head, drawing comfort from the solid, warm presence of his companion. Take care of each other, Thomas's letter continued. That's the most important thing. Dad, take care of Mom. She worries too much, but that's because she loves too much, and that's not a bad thing. Mom, take care of Dad. He pretends to be tough, but he feels everything deeply. He just doesn't show it the way you do. And both of you, take care of Jenny. She's going to need you. The next paragraph was addressed directly to his sister Jenny. You're going to be okay. I know you look up to me, but you're stronger than you think. Find someone who makes you laugh, someone who treats you the way you deserve to be treated. Don't settle for less. Live the life I won't get to live. Travel, take chances, be happy. And when you have kids someday, tell them about their Uncle Tommy. Tell them I wasn't perfect, but I tried to be good. Tell them I served with honor. Jake could barely see the words now through his tears, but he forced himself to continue, to honor this young man's final message by reading it completely. Dad, remember that business idea you mentioned in your last letter, the one about opening a hardware store? Do it. Stop waiting for the perfect moment. The perfect moment is now, always now. Life is too short and too uncertain to put off your dreams. I believe in you. I always have. Mom, your meatloaf really was the best, no matter what I joked about. And your pot roast, and your apple pie. Everything you made was perfect because it was made with love. Thank you for every meal, every packed lunch, every cookie in my care packages. Thank you for every sacrifice you made to give Jenny and me a good life. I know Dad worked hard, but you worked just as hard in ways that often went unnoticed. I noticed. I appreciate everything. The letter concluded simply, I love you all more than I can express in words. If this is goodbye, know that my last thoughts were of you, of home, of all the good things in my life. I'm not afraid. I'm at peace. Your son and brother, Tommy. Jake sat on the ground beside the car, Ranger pressing against his leg, and let himself feel the full weight of what he'd discovered. Thomas Chen had died in Vietnam, just days after writing that final letter. Jake was certain of it. The young Marine had somehow known, had felt death approaching, and had taken the time to write one last message to the people he loved. But somehow, impossibly, his personal effects had ended up in this abandoned car in rural Georgia, hidden away for over half a century. How they got here, Jake couldn't begin to fathom, but he knew with absolute certainty what he had to do. Back home in his small rental house, Jake carefully laid out all the letters on his kitchen table. He photographed each one, creating digital backups in case anything happened to the originals. Then he opened his laptop and began the painstaking process of searching for information about Corporal Thomas Chen. He started with military databases, using his veteran status to access records that weren't available to the general public. It didn't take long to find confirmation of what he already knew. Corporal Thomas Chen, United States Marine Corps, had been killed in action on October 19, 1971, during a combat operation in Quang Tri Province, Vietnam. He was 22 years old. He'd been awarded the Bronze Star posthumously for actions during the operation that cost him his life. He'd provided covering fire for his unit while they evacuated wounded, refusing to fall back until his brothers were safe. He'd saved 4 lives before losing his own. Jake spent the next several hours diving deeper into genealogy sites, military memorial pages, and public records. He learned that Thomas's parents had both passed away years ago, his father in 1989, his mother in 2003. But Thomas had a younger sister, Jennifer. Jake found her mentioned in her parents' obituaries, listed as Jennifer Chen Reeves, surviving daughter. More searching led him to a current address in Sacramento, California. Jennifer Reeves, now 72 years old, still alive, still potentially waiting for closure about a brother she'd lost over 5 decades ago. Jake's hands trembled as he picked up his phone. He'd made difficult calls before, notifying families of fallen soldiers, speaking with the wounded, coordinating with grief counselors. But this felt different. He was about to reach across 50 years of grief and loss to deliver a message that might reopen old wounds, even as it provided new comfort. He dialed the number he'd found, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Jake was preparing to leave a voicemail when a woman's voice answered, cautious and slightly wary. "Hello?" Jake took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Mrs. Reeves? Jennifer Reeves?" "Yes, this is she. Who's calling?" "Ma'am, my name is Jake Martinez. I'm a Marine Corps veteran, and He paused, suddenly unsure how to explain what he'd found, how to deliver this news. "Ma'am, I found something that belonged to your brother, Thomas Chen." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long, Jake thought the connection had dropped. He was about to speak again when he heard it, a sharp intake of breath, followed by a sound that was half gasp, half sob. "Tommy?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "You found something of Tommy's?" "Yes, ma'am. Letters. Approximately 30 letters he wrote home from Vietnam. They were never mailed. My dog and I found them in an abandoned car here in Georgia. I've read them, ma'am, and I think you need to have them. I think you need to read them." The sound on the other end was unmistakable now. 50 years of grief, of unanswered questions, of wondering and waiting, breaking free all at once. Jennifer Reeves wept openly, and Jake found himself crying along with her. 2 strangers connected across a phone line by a young Marine's words written half a century ago. "We never knew," she finally managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "They told us his personal effects were lost. Some mix-up, some mistake. We never got anything back except his dog tags and his dress uniform. I've spent my whole life wondering what his last thoughts were, if he was scared, if he thought of us. I've spent 53 years wondering if he knew how much we loved him." Jake's voice was gentle but firm. "He did, ma'am. He knew. Every single letter mentions his love for his family. Every single one talks about home, about you, about your parents. He thought about you all every day. And his final letter. Jake paused, composing himself. His final letter was written the day before he died. He knew something might happen. He wrote to tell you all how much he loved you, to tell you not to be sad, to tell you to live good lives. He was at peace, ma'am. He wasn't afraid. Jennifer Reeves wept harder, and Jake heard other voices in the background, someone asking if she was okay, what was wrong. He heard her say, "Tommy, someone found Tommy's letters." More voices, confusion, emotions spreading like ripples in a pond. After several minutes, Jennifer came back on the line, her voice stronger now, determined. "I need to see them. I need to read them. Where are you? I'll come there. I'll fly out tomorrow if I have to." "I'm in Georgia, ma'am. Pinewood, Georgia. It's a small town near Savannah." "I'll be there," she said immediately. "Give me your contact information. I'll book a flight today." 2 weeks later, Jake stood in the arrivals terminal at the Savannah Hilton Head International Airport, Ranger sitting obediently at his side. The dog wore his service vest, the one that identified him as a working animal, though today his job was simply to provide support and comfort. Jake had dressed carefully that morning, choosing to wear his Marine Corps dress blue uniform. It felt appropriate somehow, one Marine honoring another, even across the vast gulf of 50 years. His hands gripped the leather bag containing Thomas Chen's letters, the same bag Ranger had pulled from beneath that rusted car seat 2 weeks ago. The airport bustled with activity, families reuniting, business travelers hurrying past, the constant drone of announcements over the PA system. But Jake's focus was singular, his eyes scanning the arriving passengers streaming through the gate from the Sacramento flight. He'd know Jenny when he saw her, he thought, and he was right. She emerged from the jetway moving slowly, using a cane for support, but her eyes were sharp and alert, scanning the crowd with the same determination Jake had sensed over the phone. She was shorter than he'd expected, her hair silver white and pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a simple navy dress and carried a large leather purse. But it was her eyes that confirmed her identity, dark, intelligent, and brimming with barely contained emotion. In her free hand, she clutched a photograph, holding it like a talisman. Their eyes met across the terminal, and Jake saw her face crumple slightly before she visibly composed herself, straightening her shoulders and moving toward him with renewed purpose. As she approached, Jake could see the photograph more clearly. It showed a young Marine in dress blues, his cover positioned precisely, his smile wide and hopeful and heartbreakingly young. Thomas Chen, frozen forever at 22, before his final operation, before his final letter. "Mrs. Reeves," Jake said, coming to attention and rendering a crisp salute. It was instinctive, a show of respect not just for the elderly woman before him, but for the brother she'd lost, and the sacrifice that had shaped her entire life. Jennifer Reeves stopped, her eyes widening slightly at the formality, and then tears began streaming down her face. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered, "but thank you so much." Jake lowered his salute and extended his hand, which she took in both of hers, gripping it tightly. Her hands were small, weathered with age, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "Ma'am, it's an honor to meet you. Thank you for coming all this way." "I would have walked across the country if I had to," she said, her voice fierce despite the tears. "I need to see those letters. I need to hear his voice again." Jake gently lifted the leather bag, holding it between them. "He loved you all very much, ma'am. Every letter makes that clear. I think he'd want you to have these, to know what he was thinking, what he was feeling." Jennifer released Jake's hand and reached for the bag with trembling fingers. She took it carefully, reverently, as if it were made of the most precious material in the world. She opened it slowly, pulling out the first bundle of letters, and pressed them to her chest, closing her eyes. "After all these years," she whispered, "after all these years, I can hear him again." Ranger, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, stood and moved closer to Jennifer, pressing his head gently against her leg. She opened her eyes and looked down at the dog, a small smile breaking through her tears. "Is this the dog who found them?" "Yes, ma'am. This is Ranger. He and I served together in Afghanistan. He's the one who wouldn't give up, who knew something important was hidden in that car." Jennifer slowly lowered herself to her knees, ignoring the difficulty it clearly caused her, and wrapped her arms around Ranger's neck. The dog stood perfectly still, accepting her embrace with the patience and dignity Jake had always admired. "Thank you," she whispered into Ranger's fur. "Thank you for bringing my brother back to me." They made their way to the airport cafe, finding a quiet corner booth away from the main flow of traffic. Jake had already called ahead and reserved a small conference room at his hotel for later, thinking Jennifer might want privacy when she read the letters, but she insisted on starting right there in the cafe. She couldn't wait another moment. Jake ordered coffee for both of them, though neither really drank it. Jennifer carefully opened the first letter, the one from early January 1971, and began to read. Her lips moved slightly as she processed the words, occasionally forming sounds, speaking her brother's words aloud as if testing their reality. Jake sat quietly, giving her space, occasionally glancing at Ranger, who lay patiently under the table. "I can hear his voice," Jennifer said after finishing the first letter. "It's his voice, exactly as I remember it. The way he'd talk to us at the dinner table, the jokes he'd make, the way he'd reassure Mom when she worried. It's all here." She read through several more letters, sometimes laughing softly at Tommy's attempts at humor, sometimes pausing to wipe tears away. After the fifth letter, she looked up at Jake with eyes full of wonder and pain mixed together. "We got some of his letters while he was alive," she explained. "Maybe a dozen over the 13 months he was there. But they were always brief, always carefully worded to not worry us. These," she gestured to the pile of unopened envelopes, "these are different. These are honest. These are real." For the next 3 hours, they sat in that airport cafe while Jennifer read through letter after letter. She shared stories with Jake between readings, memories of growing up with Tommy, of the brother who had protected her from bullies at school, who had taught her to ride a bike by running alongside her for hours until she got it right, who had saved his allowance to buy her a birthday present when their parents were struggling financially. "He was my hero," she said simply. "Not because he was a Marine, though I was proud of that. He was my hero long before he enlisted. He was kind and patient and strong in ways that had nothing to do with physical strength. When he died, part of me died too. I was 19 years old, and suddenly my big brother was gone, and there was this hole in the world that nothing could fill." She told Jake about the decades that followed, how she'd married a good man named Robert Reeves, how they'd had 3 children and 6 grandchildren, how she'd built a good life, a happy life, but how there was always this absence, this unanswered question about Tommy's final days. The military had been brief in their notification: killed in action, died heroically, saved his brothers. But what had he thought? What had he felt? Had he been afraid? "And now I know," she said, holding up the final letter, the one dated October 18th, 1971. She hadn't read it yet, had been working through them chronologically, saving what she somehow knew would be the last for the end. "May I read this one aloud? I think I need to hear the words spoken." "Of course, ma'am," Jake said gently. Jennifer opened the final letter with shaking hands and began to read, her voice strong despite the tears flowing freely down her face. As she read Tommy's final words to his family, his instructions for them to take care of each other, his encouragement for their father to pursue his dreams, his gratitude for their mother's love, his hopes for Jenny's future, Jake found himself crying openly too. When she reached the end, "I love you all more than I can express in words. If this is goodbye, know that my last thoughts were of you, of home, of all the good things in my life. I'm not afraid. I'm at peace. Your son and brother, Tommy." Her voice broke completely, and she pressed the letter to her heart. They sat in silence for several minutes, letting the weight of those final words settle over them. Finally, Jennifer spoke, her voice hoarse but determined. "He was a good Marine, wasn't he? You can tell from his letters. The way he talked about his men, about his responsibilities. He was the kind who looked out for his brothers. "Yes, ma'am," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. He was an outstanding Marine, the kind of NCO every unit needs, every young Marine looks up to. The kind who leads from the front and never asks his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. According to his service record, he died providing covering fire so his wounded brothers could be evacuated. He saved 4 lives that day. Jennifer nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd always known. That sounds like Tommy. That sounds exactly like him. She reached across the table and squeezed Jake's hand. "Thank you for bringing him home to me, even if it's just his words. Thank you for honoring him by wearing your uniform today, for treating these letters with such respect. You didn't have to do any of this. You could have thrown them away or ignored them, but you didn't." "Ma'am, every Marine's story matters," Jake said firmly. "Every service member's sacrifice deserves to be remembered, honored, preserved. Your brother served with distinction and died protecting his brothers. The least I could do was make sure his words reached his family, even if it took 53 years. They spent the rest of the afternoon together. Jake drove Jennifer to his hotel, where they'd reserved that conference room, and she read through all the letters again, this time more slowly, savoring every word. She told Jake more stories about Tommy, painting a complete picture of the young man who'd written those letters. Jake shared his own experiences as a Marine, finding common threads across the decades that separated their service. War changed, technology evolved, but the fundamental bonds between Marines remained constant. As the sun began to set, casting golden light through the hotel windows, Jennifer carefully repacked all the letters into their leather bag. "I'm going to take these home," she said. "I'm going to share them with my children and grandchildren. They've heard stories about Uncle Tommy, but now they can read his own words. They can know him the way I knew him." She paused, looking directly at Jake. "But I want you to know something. You and Ranger didn't just find letters in an old car. You gave me back my brother. You answered questions I've carried for 53 years. You gave me peace." Jake drove Jennifer back to the airport that evening for her red-eye flight home. As they said their goodbyes at the departure gate, she hugged him tightly, then knelt once more, with great effort, to embrace Ranger. "You're both heroes," she whispered. "Never forget that." As Jake drove home that night, Ranger asleep in the passenger seat, he felt something shift inside him. Since coming home from Afghanistan, he'd been struggling with purpose, wondering if his best days were behind him, if he'd left the meaningful part of his life in the desert. But today had shown him differently. Service didn't end with discharge papers or retirement ceremonies.